Stay away. Your cheap food smell makes me sick. Richard Halston shouted so loudly that the 3 employees standing near the executive elevators all turned toward them at once. He immediately clamped one hand over his nose and took 2 steps back from Annie, as though standing near her for even a few more seconds would be unbearable. The excitement that had been on his face moments earlier over the important signing twisted into open disgust. God, what is that smell? Annie Bennett stood motionless for several seconds. Instead of looking at Richard right away, she lowered her eyes to the lunch scattered across the floor at her feet. The collision had knocked the lid clean off the container. Pieces of cornbread her mother had baked that morning had broken apart near the wall. Collard greens and macaroni and cheese were scattered across the polished stone floor, while a thin streak of sauce had splashed across the toe of Richard's dark brown leather shoe. Now the food lay at the feet of a man who was looking at it as though it were garbage. Annie slowly raised her eyes. You ran into me. Richard lowered his hand slightly from his nose, his eyes narrowing at once. I did what? You came around that corner while you were looking at your phone. Your shoulder hit me. Richard glanced at the phone still in his hand. For a moment, Annie thought he might acknowledge what was painfully obvious, but Richard's eyes quickly shifted from the phone to her. He took in her simple navy polo, khaki pants, clean sneakers, and the temporary visitor badge clipped to her shirt. Annie. Visitor. That was all. No title. No Bennett Global logo. His gaze returned to the food on the floor, and whatever hesitation had briefly appeared vanished. Do you hear yourself? Richard asked. You dumped this mess in the middle of my executive floor, and somehow you managed to make me responsible for it? Annie frowned. I didn't dump anything. You ran into me. Oh, please. Richard pulled a neatly folded white handkerchief from the breast pocket of his suit jacket. He bent down and rubbed hard at the streak of sauce on the toe of his shoe. The stain was no larger than a fingertip, but Richard kept wiping at it as though Annie had destroyed something priceless. These are handmade. Annie looked at him but said nothing. Richard glanced up, as though her silence irritated him even more. Do you even know what a pair of handmade shoes like these costs? I know the price of your shoes doesn't change what happened. Richard's jaw tightened instantly. What happened, he said, emphasizing every word, is that you brought this greasy food onto the executive floor, wandered around somewhere you obviously don't belong, and nearly ruined a pair of shoes that probably cost more than whatever you make in a month. Annie studied him for several more seconds. That morning, before she left home, her father had given her one instruction. Don't tell them who you are unless you truly need to. Watch how they behave when they don't know we're watching. At the time, Annie had thought her father was being a little too cautious. Now she was beginning to understand. At the far end of the hallway, a facilities employee named Carlos hurried toward them, pushing a small cleaning cart. He had heard Richard shouting from down the hall. As soon as he reached them, Carlos looked at the spilled food, then at Annie, then at Richard. I've got it, Mr. Halston. It'll only take me a minute. Carlos had just started reaching for the paper towels when Richard raised a hand. No. Carlos stopped. Sir? I said no. Richard pointed directly at Annie. She made the mess. She cleans it. Carlos looked at Annie. The discomfort on his face was obvious. It's really no trouble, Mr. Halston. This is my job. I can have it cleaned up in a minute. Richard turned fully toward Carlos. And I just told you not to clean it. Carlos froze. Annie spoke, her voice still controlled even though her expression had gone cold. Mr. Halston, I've already made myself very clear. You ran into me. Richard gave a short laugh. Still arguing. I'm explaining what happened. No, you're trying to avoid responsibility. Carlos was still holding the roll of paper towels. Mr. Halston, really, I can take care of it. It's no problem. Richard snapped his head toward him. Carlos. His voice dropped. Go back to work. Carlos remained where he was. But, Mr. Halston, no. No one said another word. Carlos looked at Annie once more. There was an apology in his eyes that he did not dare put into words. Finally, he turned the cleaning cart around and reluctantly pushed it away. Richard waited until Carlos was far enough down the hall before turning back to Annie. There, problem solved. Annie looked down at the floor. A piece of cornbread lay near the toe of her sneaker. She remembered her mother smiling that morning as she slipped 2 extra pieces into the container. You'll be hungry after running around checking everything. Heat rose in Annie's chest, but she refused to let it show. Richard pointed toward the floor at her feet. Pick it up. Annie slowly raised her eyes. Excuse me? You heard me. He pointed at the floor again. Get down there and clean it up. Annie did not move. Richard stared at her as though he could not believe anyone would dare ignore an order from him. He took another step back and covered his nose again. And do it quickly. That smell is getting worse. A woman standing near the elevators immediately lowered her eyes. The man beside her suddenly became so interested in the tablet in his hands that he nearly buried his face in the screen. Annie noticed everything. She could see how uncomfortable they were, and she could tell they knew Richard had been the one who ran into her. But not one of them was brave enough to say it. Perhaps it was because the name Halston Industries was mounted in enormous steel letters across the lobby downstairs. Or perhaps it was because the man standing in front of her was the one who signed their paychecks. Annie slowly drew in a breath. "Mr. Halston, I'm here for the signing with Bennett Global." Richard stared at her for a second. Then he laughed. "You?" "Yes." "In what capacity?" Annie did not answer immediately. She gave him a few seconds to wonder why an 18-year-old girl wearing a visitor badge knew exactly about a signing that was almost entirely restricted to senior executives. Richard did not ask. Instead, he looked down at her badge. "Annie, visitor." The corner of his mouth curled into a dismissive smile. "Let me guess. Catering?" "No." "Event setup?" "No." "Somebody's assistant?" "None of those." Richard exhaled through his nose. "Then perhaps whoever sent you up here should have explained the dress code." Annie looked down at herself. Her polo was clean, her khakis fit properly, and her sneakers had been freshly wiped that morning. Her father was the one who had told her not to wear a suit. He wanted her to walk through the company like an ordinary person and see how the place operated before the Bennett delegation arrived. Annie looked back at him. "What's wrong with the way I'm dressed?" Richard did not answer directly. "This is where serious business gets done. We have extremely important people arriving today, and they expect a certain standard." "What standard?" Richard folded his arms. "One that doesn't include food spilled across the hallway and employees arguing with executives." "I'm not an employee." Richard let out an irritated laugh. "Whatever you are doesn't matter. Look down." He pointed at the floor. "Look at what you've done." Annie's voice grew quieter, but not weaker. "You keep saying that as though repeating it enough times will somehow make it true." Richard's expression changed. Until that moment, he had only been angry about his shoe and the spilled food. But now, with employees around them pretending not to listen, the confrontation had become something else. Richard needed to win. He stepped closer to Annie. "You know what your problem is?" Annie met his eyes. "I'm listening." "You don't understand where you are." Annie slowly looked down the executive hallway, where the glass walls reflected the Halston Industries logo, and the large conference room at the far end had already been prepared for a signing worth more than $1 billion. "I know exactly where I am." "No, you don't." Richard moved half a step closer. But when he caught another trace of the food's aroma, he grimaced and backed away again, as though determined to remind everyone how offensive he found it. "This is Halston Industries. In less than an hour, I'll be sitting across from the people who control one of the largest privately held logistics networks in the United States. Lawyers, bankers, senior executives, members of the press, financial advisors, they'll all be here. I have spent 11 months preparing for today." Richard pointed toward the food scattered at Annie's feet. "And then, right before the signing, you show up and make this entire floor look cheap." Annie studied him for a long moment. "Because of my lunch?" "Not just your lunch." Richard's eyes swept over her from head to toe again. "All of it." Annie did not blink. Richard continued. "The clothes, the food, the way you show up here, and that attitude." This time Annie's expression turned genuinely cold. "My attitude?" "Yes. Someone lets you into a place like this, and you behave as though everyone owes you an explanation." Annie was silent for several seconds. "If I were wearing a $5,000 suit, would you be speaking to me differently?" Richard smirked. "If you could afford a $5,000 suit, maybe you would have learned not to carry a box of smelly food onto an executive floor." Annie looked down at the lunch on the floor. "My mother made it." Richard answered without hesitation. "Then your mother should have kept it at home." Something changed in Annie's eyes. She would remember those exact words. Richard had no idea that the woman who had prepared the food he had just mocked was Victoria Bennett, the very woman he would be shaking hands with, smiling at, and doing everything possible to impress within a matter of minutes. He turned toward the employees nearby and spread one hand as though Annie were evidence in some kind of presentation. "Everybody, look at this. This is what happens when people don't understand basic standards. We've spent months preparing for today, and now, with only about 20 minutes before the Bennett team arrives, I'm standing here dealing with this mess in the middle of the executive floor. Annie answered calmly. Nobody here seems confused about who caused it except you. A woman nearby almost smiled. She immediately lowered her head, but it was too late. Richard had seen it. His face flushed red. That's enough. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out his leather wallet. Richard took out a black card, glanced at it, then slid it back into place. You know what? I've changed my mind. You're going to pay for this. Annie frowned. Pay for what? My shoes. Annie nearly laughed because she could not believe what she had just heard. Your shoes? And the cleaning. There's one small spot of sauce on one shoe. Because of you. Because you ran into me. Richard pointed at the bag hanging from Annie's shoulder. Take out your wallet. Annie stood still. What did you just say? You heard me. Take out your wallet. No. Richard stared at her as though no one had ever said that word to him before. No, I'm not paying for your mistake. Richard looked around at the nearby employees as though asking them to witness the outrageous disrespect he believed he was being subjected to. Unbelievable. He turned back to Annie. You spill food on a private executive floor, damage my property, argue with me in front of my employees, and now you refuse to take responsibility. Annie tilted her head slightly. That's a very creative version of the last 5 minutes. Richard clenched his jaw. Wallet. No. I told you to take it out. Annie folded her arms across her chest. And I already gave you my answer. Richard stepped closer. Do you want me to call security? Annie looked at him. If you think calling security is going to help you. Richard stopped. For exactly 1 second. Something in the way she said it triggered a warning somewhere in the back of his mind that he was missing something important. But Richard Halston had spent his entire life believing that his instincts about people were rarely wrong. He looked once more at the visitor badge, then at Annie's simple clothes. Arrogance 1. Fine. Then let's make this very simple. He pointed at the floor. You pay to have my shoes cleaned. You get down there and clean up this mess, and then you leave the executive floor before the Bennett family arrives. Annie did not look down. She looked toward the elevators. The small digital indicator above the doors had just changed to another number. 18, 19, 20. Richard noticed that she was looking elsewhere. What are you looking at? Annie turned her eyes back to him. Nothing. Richard pointed at the floor one more time. Then get down there and clean it up. Annie remained exactly where she was. Richard's finger was still pointed at the food scattered across the stone floor, rigid as though that gesture alone were enough to turn his words into an order no one was allowed to disobey. I'm not going to repeat myself again. Annie looked at the finger pointing toward the floor before slowly raising her eyes to meet his. You already have, she replied, several times. A few employees nearby instinctively exchanged glances. They lasted only a second, but Richard caught them. His face immediately tightened. You think this is funny? No, because from where I'm standing, you're treating this whole thing like some kind of joke. Annie drew in a slow breath, never raising her voice. From where I'm standing, you ran into me, blamed me for it, insulted my lunch, insulted the way I'm dressed, and now you want me to pay you. Richard let out a dry laugh. There, that attitude, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Annie did not respond immediately. Her eyes drifted toward the digital indicator above the elevator doors. The numbers were still climbing. Richard noticed again. Stop looking at the elevator. Annie turned back to him. I think I'm allowed to look at an elevator. You're allowed to do what you've been told to do. You didn't ask me. Annie kept her eyes on his face. You ordered me. Richard tilted his head slightly, a cold smile appearing on his lips. You should understand that in a place like this, the difference between the two matters a lot less than you think. At the far end of the hallway, Carlos had not completely left. He had stopped with his cleaning cart some distance away, one hand resting on the handle, clearly uncertain whether he should keep walking or come back and clean up the food before the guests arrived. Richard spotted him. Carlos. Carlos immediately looked up. Yes, sir. Why are you still standing there? Carlos hesitated, glancing at the food on the floor. I just thought it should be cleaned up before the guests arrive. Richard immediately pointed toward Annie. She's handling it. Carlos looked at Annie. Miss, if you want, I can just... No. Richard cut him off so sharply that Carlos flinched. I already told you. Annie turned toward Carlos, her voice softening. Thank you. You don't need to get involved. Richard immediately laughed, though there was nothing amused about it. See? Now she's giving orders. Annie turned back to him. I'm speaking to him. In my building. Annie stared at Richard for several seconds, as though she genuinely wanted to make sure she had heard him correctly. Do people need your permission to speak to each other in here? The man holding the tablet shifted his weight. The woman near the elevators pressed her lips together to hide her reaction. Richard looked from one employee to another, increasingly aware that he had become the center of attention in the hallway. What is everyone doing? He snapped. Get back to work. The employees quickly scattered a few steps farther away, but none of them actually went far. They opened screens, picked up folders, and pretended to be busy while their attention remained fixed on the confrontation. Richard waited several seconds before turning back to Annie. This time he lowered his voice, but the anger behind every word was even more obvious. You have absolutely no idea how much work has gone into today. I've already heard you say that. Then start acting like it matters to you. It does matter to me. Not enough for you to understand that greasy food doesn't belong in the executive area. Annie's eyes dropped to the container on the floor. Among the spilled food, a paper napkin her mother had neatly folded that morning was still half tucked beneath the lid. Strangely, it had remained almost completely clean. Anya bent down. A satisfied smile immediately appeared on Richard's face. There you go, finally learning. But Annie only picked up the napkin. She unfolded it, gently wiped a small spot of sauce from the sleeve of her polo, then stood straight again. Richard's smile disappeared. If Annie's courage and dignity touched you, please like this video, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel to see what happens when Richard finally learns who she really is. What are you doing? Cleaning my shirt. I told you to clean the floor. Annie folded the napkin. This building has a facilities department. Richard pointed toward Carlos, who was still standing farther down the hallway. The man I specifically sent away because you need to learn something. Annie tucked the napkin into her bag. And what exactly do you think I need to learn? Responsibility. Annie looked at him. Responsibility for your mistake. Responsibility for showing up somewhere you clearly don't understand and behaving as though the rules don't apply to you. What rule says the person who gets hit has to pay? The corner of Richard's mouth twitched. He did not answer. Instead, he pulled out his phone. Fine, let's settle the money first. Annie watched his fingers move quickly across the screen. What are you doing? Richard did not look up. Checking the replacement cost of my shoes. Annie stared at him in disbelief. You cannot be serious. Richard tapped the screen a few more times, then read the number aloud. $3,800. Annie froze for a moment. For a spot of sauce you already wiped off? For the shoes. The shoes are perfectly fine. That's not your decision to make. Richard turned the phone toward her. On the screen was a product page from a luxury shoe brand with the price clearly displayed. $3,800. Add professional cleaning and all the disruption you've caused today. He paused for a second, as though considering a figure in the middle of a business negotiation. Let's make it an even $4,000. This time Annie actually let out a short laugh at the sheer absurdity of it. Richard's face immediately darkened. You think $4,000 is funny? I think someone running into another person and then demanding $4,000 from them is absurd. I don't care what you think. That much has been obvious for a while. Richard held out his hand. Wallet. Annie narrowed her eyes. Again? Take it out. No. Richard stepped closer, still carefully avoiding the spilled food as though it were the most dangerous thing in the hallway. If you can't afford it, just say so. Annie remained silent. Richard took her silence as confirmation that he was right. There's no shame in admitting you don't have the money. I never said that. No. You're trying to turn this into some moral argument about right and wrong because $4,000 is probably completely beyond your means. Annie looked at him, but this time she did not interrupt. She let him continue, and Richard did. His eyes once again dropped to her polo shirt, khaki pants, and simple sneakers. Look, I understand. When you're used to counting every dollar you spend, $4,000 probably sounds like a fortune. But your financial situation doesn't erase the consequences of what you've done. A woman standing near the wall finally could not stay silent any longer. Mr. Halston, maybe we should wait until we know exactly what happened. Richard spun toward her. Melissa, were you standing here when it happened? Melissa hesitated. No. Then you don't know what happened. Annie immediately replied. Apparently, neither do you. Melissa quickly lowered her head, but Richard had heard every word. He turned back to Annie and pointed directly at the bag hanging from her shoulder. "Last time, wallet." Annie slowly exhaled. Then, under Richard's gaze and the eyes of everyone still pretending not to watch, she reached into her bag. At last, the corner of Richard's mouth relaxed. A flicker of satisfaction appeared on his face. "Good." Annie pulled out a small leather wallet. "Finally, we're making some progress." She opened it. Richard held out his hand and waited. Annie did not give him the wallet. His face immediately tightened. "What are you doing? You told me to take out my wallet." "Yes, Paime." Annie calmly pulled out a $20 bill. Richard looked at the bill, then at her. "What is that?" $20. "I can see that. It's all the cash I'm carrying." Richard gave a contemptuous laugh. "Of course it is." Annie looked at him for a few seconds, then calmly slipped the bill back into her wallet. "I never said I was giving it to you." The smile vanished from Richard's face. "Then use a card." "No." "Do you have one?" "Yes." "Then use it." "No." Richard turned toward the people around them as though Annie's refusal had become a public insult directed at his authority. Unbelievable. She makes a mess, damages property, refuses to clean it up, and now she refuses to pay for it. Annie closed her wallet and put it back inside her bag. "You keep announcing your version of what happened to everyone because you want someone to agree with you." Richard snapped back toward her. "I don't need anyone to agree with me." "Then stop performing for them." The words hit him harder than Annie had intended. The air around them seemed to freeze. Richard strode straight toward Annie, stopping only a few steps away. His face had turned red, and the hand holding his phone tightened. "You need to understand something." He forced each word through clenched teeth. "In just a few minutes, the Bennett family will be stepping onto this floor. Everything today has to reflect the standards of this company. The way employees dress, the furniture in the conference room, the champagne glasses, even the way people stand when they walk through those doors. 11 months. I have spent 11 months on this deal." Richard swept one hand toward the spilled food. "And instead of a perfect executive floor, I have food scattered everywhere, employees standing around, and you arguing with me over something as basic as accountability." Annie looked at him. "If today really matters that much, maybe you should be more careful about how you treat the people who are already here." Richard narrowed his eyes. "Are you threatening me?" "No." "Then what is that supposed to mean?" "Exactly what I said." Annie's gaze returned to the elevators. The number above the doors continued to rise. 24, 25, 26. Richard noticed immediately. "There you go again." Annie said nothing. He followed her gaze to the changing numbers, then looked back at her. "You're waiting for someone?" This time Annie did not avoid the question. "Yes." Richard paused. "Who?" Annie adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. There was no anger left on her face. Somehow, that calmness made her next answer more unsettling than any challenge could have been. "You'll know soon enough." Richard stared at her. A faint sense of unease flickered in his eyes, but it lasted only a few seconds. He looked at the visitor badge, at her simple clothes, at the lunch container on the floor. Richard laughed, as though dismissing a ridiculous thought from his mind. "I don't care who you're waiting for." Annie gave a small nod. "Yes." She looked him directly in the eyes. "You've made that very clear." At that exact moment, a soft chime sounded from the elevators. Ding! Nearly everyone nearby turned toward the sound at once. The number above the doors stopped changing. Richard turned too. Richard gave a short, dismissive laugh. "That sounds like a threat." "It isn't." "Then explain it." "I don't think I need to." His eyes narrowed. "You walk onto my executive floor, spill your lunch, refuse to clean it, refuse to pay for my shoes, and now you're giving me cryptic answers?" Annie adjusted the strap of her bag. "You keep leaving out the part where you walked into me. There you go again." "Because it keeps being true." Richard turned toward Melissa. "Are we seriously still doing this?" Melissa hesitated. "Mr. Halston, maybe we should just review the security footage." That stopped him. Annie looked toward the small camera mounted above the intersection of the two hallways. Richard followed her gaze. Melissa continued. "It should show what happened." For a second, Richard seemed to consider it. Then he slipped his phone into his jacket. "We are not wasting time reviewing security footage over spilled lunch." Annie almost smiled. 5 minutes ago you wanted $4,000 over it. That's different." "How?" "Because my property was damaged. The footage would show whose fault that was." Richard's expression tightened. Carlos, still waiting with his cart farther away, looked down at the floor. Richard pointed at him. "Carlos, I told you to leave. I'm waiting for the hallway to clear, sir." "It would already be clear if she'd done what she was told," Annie said. "Or if you let him do his job 10 minutes ago." Richard turned back to her. "Do you always have an answer for everything?" "Only when someone keeps accusing me of things I didn't do." He shook his head. "You know, this is exactly the problem with people who come into places like this without understanding how business works." Annie's expression changed. "People who come into places like this? You know what I mean." "No, tell me." Richard made an impatient gesture. "Don't turn every sentence into something it isn't. You're the one saying it. I'm talking about professionalism." "Then talk about professionalism." "I have been." "No, you've talked about my clothes, my food, what you think I earn, and what you think I can afford." Richard glanced at the employees nearby. "You hear this? Now I'm apparently on trial because I asked somebody to clean up after herself." Annie answered before anyone else could. "Nobody put you on trial. You're certainly acting like it. I'm asking you to take responsibility for walking into me. And I'm telling you I have more important things to deal with. Then why are you still here?" Richard's mouth opened, but no answer came immediately. Melissa looked away. Annie continued. "You could have said, 'Sorry, I wasn't looking.' Carlos could have cleaned the floor. We both could have moved on." Richard's voice dropped. "You want an apology? I wanted one when it happened. And now? Now I want to know how far you plan to take this." Richard gave a humorless laugh. "You really think you have some kind of leverage here? I never said that. You didn't have to." He glanced at her bag again. "Maybe you think someone in the Bennett group is going to protect you. Is that it? You work for one of their contractors?" Annie said nothing. "Or maybe you know somebody on their staff." "Nothing." Richard stepped a little closer. "That would explain the attitude." Annie finally answered. "What attitude?" "This idea that normal rules don't apply to you." She raised an eyebrow. "That's interesting coming from you." Melissa closed her eyes briefly. Richard caught the reaction. "Melissa, if you have somewhere else to be, go. I'm waiting for the Bennett legal team. They're not here yet." "Understood. Then wait in the conference suite." Melissa picked up her tablet and left without arguing. Richard watched her go, then looked at Annie. "See what you've done? Everybody's standing around distracted because you couldn't carry a lunch container properly." Annie's patience thinned. "You walked into me. Enough. No, you keep telling everyone I ruined something. You're the one who turned a spilled lunch into a public spectacle." Richard pointed toward the food. "That is sitting there because of you. And Carlos offered to clean it. You need to learn consequences." Annie looked down at the cornbread, then at the shoe Richard had already wiped clean. "What consequence are you trying to teach me exactly? That when you damage something, you pay for it? You mean like when you walk into someone and knock her lunch onto the floor?" His face tightened again. Before he could answer, a voice came from behind them. "Is everything all right here?" Walter Green approached from the security station. His suit jacket was open, and a radio rested against his belt. He took in the spilled food, Carlos waiting nearby, and Richard standing a few feet from Annie. Richard turned toward him. "Finally, I need her removed from this floor." Walter looked at Annie, then back at Richard. "Removed? She's refusing to clean up this mess. She damaged my shoes, and she's been arguing with me for the last 10 minutes. Walter's expression shifted slightly. "Mr. Halston, I think there may be some confusion." "There's no confusion." Annie spoke. "He walked into me." Walter nodded once. "Understood." Richard frowned. "What exactly do you understand?" Walter looked at the camera above the hallway. "If necessary, security can document the incident." Richard's voice sharpened. "I don't need an investigation. I need the hallway cleared before Jonathan and Victoria Bennett arrive." Walter checked his watch. "They're already in the building." Richard immediately adjusted his jacket. "What?" "Their vehicle arrived a few minutes ahead of schedule." Richard's entire manner changed. "Why wasn't I told? I was coming to notify you." He glanced toward Annie. Richard noticed. "What?" Walter said nothing. Richard followed his eyes. "Why do you keep looking at her?" Walter turned fully toward Annie. "Because I was also looking for her." Richard's forehead creased. Annie did not help him. Walter stepped closer. "I'm sorry this happened, Miss Bennett." Richard's hand slowly lowered from the front of his jacket. "What did you call her?" Walter answered naturally. "Miss Bennett." Richard looked from Walter to Annie, then at the visitor badge clipped to her shirt. Annie. Visitor. His lips parted. Bennett. Walter's radio crackled before he could say more. Executive elevator approaching. Bennett party on board. Walter touched the radio. Copy. Richard turned toward the elevator indicator. The numbers were climbing. He looked back at Annie. Who exactly are you? Annie met his eyes. You wanted me gone before the Bennett family arrived. The elevator climbed another floor. So maybe you should wait and ask them. The elevator indicator changed again. Richard looked at Walter, then at Annie, and for the first time since the argument began, he seemed unsure which person he should address. Miss Bennett, he said carefully, testing the name as if there might still be another explanation. You're with the Bennett team? Annie kept her eyes on him. You were very certain 5 minutes ago that I wasn't. That isn't what I asked. No, but it's what matters. Richard glanced toward Walter. Which Bennett is she? Walter did not answer immediately. His expression made it clear that the question itself surprised him. Richard lowered his voice. Walter, I think it would be better if Miss Bennett answered that herself. The elevator moved one floor closer. Richard turned to Annie again. The contempt in his face had disappeared. In its place came an awkward professionalism that had not existed when he thought she was catering staff. Look, Annie, clearly this got out of hand. Annie noticed the change at once. A few minutes earlier she had been you, staff, and the woman who needed to clean the floor. Now he was using her first name. Did it? Yes, obviously. You wanted security to remove me. That was before I understood the situation. What changed? Richard's lips pressed together. I think you know. Annie did. Walter's radio crackled again. Executive elevator arriving. Richard straightened his tie. All right. We do not need to make this bigger than it is. Annie almost laughed. You spent the last 10 minutes making it bigger. I was frustrated. You were insulting me. There's a difference. Not from where I was standing. Richard glanced toward the scattered lunch. I shouldn't have commented on the food. You commented on more than the food. I said I shouldn't have. That isn't an apology. Richard's face tightened for a second before he forced it away. Fine. I apologize. Annie waited. He looked impatient again. What? That was fast. An apology is an apology. Would you have given it if Walter hadn't called me Miss Bennett? Richard said nothing. The elevator bell sounded. His entire posture changed. He adjusted the front of his jacket, checked his cuffs, and smoothed the side of his hair with one hand. Then he turned toward the doors with the polished smile of a man preparing to welcome the most important guests of his year. Before the doors opened, he spoke without looking at Annie. Let's handle this after the signing. Annie's eyebrows lifted. After? We have $1 billion agreement waiting in the conference suite. There are lawyers, bankers, and executives involved. Whatever happened here can be discussed privately afterward. You mean after you get the signatures? Richard looked at her. I mean after everyone does what they came here to do. The doors opened. Jonathan Bennett stepped out first, a dark leather document case in one hand. Victoria walked beside him, followed by their general counsel, chief financial officer, and 2 advisors. Richard moved forward immediately, his smile widening. Jonathan, Victoria, welcome. I'm glad you made it ahead of schedule. Traffic was lighter than expected, Jonathan said. Richard extended his hand. Perfect. Everything is ready. Legal has the final copies inside. The press team is downstairs, and I think we can get through the formalities without any delay. Jonathan reached forward to shake his hand, but his attention shifted past Richard. Annie was standing near the wall with her lunch scattered at her feet. Jonathan's hand stopped before the handshake was completed. Victoria saw her a second later. Her expression changed immediately. Annie? Richard followed their attention. A flash of panic crossed his face. But he moved quickly, trying to recover the situation before it could be explained. Oh yes, one of the staff had a little accident out here. Nothing serious. Annie's eyes narrowed. Richard stepped sideways and made a small motion with his arm, trying to move Annie out of the path between himself and the Bennetts. Excuse us, young lady. We need to get everyone into the conference suite. Annie did not move. Richard lowered his voice. Please, not now. Jonathan was already walking toward them. Sweetheart, what happened? Richard froze. Victoria moved directly to Annie. Honey, are you all right? I'm fine, Mom. The word landed harder than any accusation could have. Richard's face drained of color. He looked at Annie, then Jonathan, then Victoria. His mouth opened, but nothing useful came out. Mom? He finally repeated. Victoria ignored him. She looked at the food on the floor, then at Annie's sleeve, then at Richard's handkerchief. What happened here? Richard recovered just enough to speak. Victoria, there's been a misunderstanding. Annie turned toward him. That's what you're calling it now? Jonathan looked from his daughter to Richard. Richard? Richard lifted both hands. Jonathan, please. It was a small incident. I didn't know who she was. Annie's expression sharpened. Jonathan noticed. What does that mean? Richard tried again. She was here early. There was food on the floor. We had a disagreement about what happened. I thought she was with event support. You thought I was catering, Annie said. Richard gave her a quick warning look. That's not exactly what I said. You asked if I was catering, event setup, or somebody's assistant. Victoria turned to Richard. Did you? He hesitated. I may have asked what capacity she was here in. Annie continued. Then you told me my clothes looked cheap. You said my food made this floor look cheap. You said the smell made you sick. Richard's confidence weakened further. Annie, I already apologized. After Walter called me Miss Bennett. Jonathan looked at Walter. Walter gave a small nod. Yes, sir. Richard's attention snapped toward him. Walter, that isn't necessary. Jonathan's voice hardened. I'll decide what's necessary. Richard went quiet. Annie straightened her shirt where Richard had touched her arm earlier. Then she looked directly at him. I've been here for quite a while. Richard swallowed. Annie pointed toward the lunch on the floor. And that cheap food you said was making you sick? My mother packed it for me this morning. Victoria looked down at the cornbread and greens she had prepared only hours earlier. Annie continued, her voice firm. It's also the food that helped raise the heir to the company you've been waiting almost a year to do business with. Richard's face turned pale. Annie did not raise her voice. Your arrogance just burned $1 billion deal to the ground, Mr. Halston. Jonathan looked at his daughter for a moment, then at Richard. Tell me everything that happened. Annie looked at her father, then at Victoria. I came up early like you asked. I checked the conference suite, the nameplates, the closing binders, and the press area. Everything was ready. I had some time before you arrived, so I took out my lunch. Richard shifted beside them. Jonathan, before this goes any further, I really think we should... Jonathan raised one hand. Let her finish. Richard stopped. Annie continued. I was near the executive hallway when Mr. Halston came around the corner looking at his phone. His shoulder hit mine, and the container fell. Victoria glanced down at the food. He ran into you? Yes. Richard stepped in. It was a collision. We both came around the corner at the same time. Annie looked at him. You spent the last 15 minutes saying I caused it. I was frustrated. You said I dumped food on your floor. Richard pressed his lips together. Jonathan looked at Annie again. Go on. He saw some sauce on his shoe. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't apologize. He covered his nose and said my food smelled disgusting. Richard shook his head. I didn't use that exact word. Annie turned to him. You said, stay away. Your cheap food smell makes me sick. Victoria's expression tightened. Richard looked toward her. Victoria, it came out badly. What came out badly? She asked. The words or what you meant. That isn't fair. No, Victoria said. What happened to Annie wasn't fair. Richard's general counsel and the Bennett advisors remained a few steps away. No one opened the conference suite doors. The signing folders waiting inside suddenly seemed much less urgent. Annie went on. Carlos came over to clean the floor. Jonathan glanced toward the facilities employee, who was still standing near his cart. Carlos gave a small nod. Mr. Halston stopped him, Annie said. He said I had to clean it myself. Jonathan looked at Richard. You stopped your own employee from cleaning a spill? I wanted her to take responsibility. For being hit? That's her version. Annie answered before Jonathan could. Then, check the hallway camera. Richard's face tightened. Jonathan followed Annie's glance toward the security camera. Is there footage? Walter replied. Yes, sir. The hallway is covered. Richard quickly said. We don't need to turn this into some formal investigation. Jonathan looked at him. You were ready to call security on my daughter 10 minutes ago. That was before I understood the situation. Annie's eyes stayed on him. Jonathan heard the wording too. Before you understood what situation? Richard hesitated. Before I understood who she was. Annie's face changed slightly, but she said nothing yet. Victoria folded her arms. Keep going, Annie. He told me my clothes were wrong for the floor. He said the lunch made the place look cheap. He assumed I was catering, event staff, or somebody's assistant. Richard interrupted. I asked what she was doing here. That's not the same thing. You laughed when I said I was here for the Bennett signing, Annie replied. Richard looked away for a moment. He also told everyone standing nearby that I was ruining the day, Annie continued. He said 11 months of preparation were being damaged because I had made the executive floor look cheap. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Anything else? He wanted me to pay for his shoes. Victoria looked at Richard as if she had misheard. Pay for his shoes? $3,800, Annie said. Then he added cleaning costs and made it $4,000. Jonathan turned to Richard. You demanded $4,000 from her? Richard spread his hands. The shoes are expensive, and at that point I believed she had damaged them. There was a small sauce mark, Annie said. He wiped it off. Richard's voice rose. That isn't the point, Annie answered. Then what was? He stopped. She continued. He told me to take out my wallet, more than once. Victoria's face hardened. You ordered her to hand over money? I told her there should be consequences for damaging someone's property. You didn't even know what happened, Victoria said. I thought I did. That seems to be a habit. Richard looked at Jonathan. We've worked together for almost a year. You know me better than this. Jonathan did not answer. Anna get, Gonzakaria, Gonzati added. When I refused to pay, he threatened to call security and have me removed before you arrived. Richard pointed toward the scattered food. Because she would not clean it. Carlos finally spoke. Mr. Bennett, I offered to clean it twice. Richard turned sharply. Carlos. Jonathan looked at him. Let him speak. Carlos kept his voice respectful. I told Mr. Halston it would take me a minute. He told me not to touch it. He said Miss Bennett had to do it herself. Jonathan nodded once. Thank you. Carlos stepped back. Annie continued. Melissa suggested checking the security footage. He refused. Then Walter came over. Mr. Halston told him to remove me. Walter added, That's correct. Richard's face had lost the confidence he carried when the Bennetts stepped off the elevator. Jonathan looked at him. Is any part of what Annie just said untrue? Richard immediately replied. Jonathan, you have to understand the context. That wasn't my question. This was a misunderstanding that escalated. Is any part of it untrue? Richard looked toward the advisors, then Victoria, then Annie. I didn't know who she was. Annie finally spoke. That's the point. Richard looked at her. Annie took one step forward. If you had known my last name, would you have told me my food smelled cheap? Of course not. Would you have ordered me to get on the floor and clean it? Richard said nothing. Would you have demanded $4,000? Annie, I've already said. Would you have called security? He did not answer. Annie nodded. Exactly. Richard's voice softened. I made assumptions. You decided how much respect I deserved before I finished one sentence. That's not what I meant. It's what you did. Victoria looked at Richard. You were courteous, the second Walter called her Miss Bennett. Richard rubbed one hand across his jaw, because I realized there had been a mistake. Victoria shook her head. The mistake wasn't that Annie turned out to be our daughter. The mistake was thinking the person you thought she was deserved less respect. Richard looked toward Jonathan. I understand how this looks. Jonathan's answer came quietly. No, Richard. I think for the first time today, we understand exactly how it looks. He turned toward Bennett Global's general counsel. The attorney waited. Jonathan looked through the open conference suite doors at the signing binders prepared across the table. Then he said, Don't open those files yet. Richard stepped forward. Jonathan faced him again. We're not signing anything until we decide whether there's still a partner worth signing with. Richard's face changed at once. Jonathan, that's not a reasonable conclusion to reach from one bad interaction. Jonathan did not answer immediately. He looked toward the conference suite, where two thick closing binders rested beside fountain pens and neatly printed nameplates. Then he turned back to Richard. One bad interaction? That's what this was. Victoria shook her head. You keep reducing it because you don't like the size of the consequence. Richard looked at her. I'm not reducing anything. I'm saying we've spent 11 months negotiating a partnership that affects two companies, thousands of employees, lenders, suppliers, and international partners. We shouldn't throw that away because I lost my temper for 10 minutes. Annie spoke before either parent could respond. You didn't lose your temper once. Richard turned toward her. You kept making choices, she continued. Carlos offered to clean the floor. You stopped him. Melissa suggested checking the camera. You refused. I told you what happened more than once. You still demanded money. Richard rubbed the bridge of his nose. I know what happened. No, Annie said. Now you know who it happened to. His hand dropped. Jonathan glanced at Walter. Can you pull the hallway footage? Yes, sir. Richard immediately stepped in. That isn't necessary. Jonathan looked at him. Why? Because I'm not disputing that we collided. You were disputing it 20 minutes ago. I was mistaken. And the camera can tell us how. Richard's jaw tightened. Jonathan, this is becoming theatrical. Walter remained by the security station, waiting for instructions. Jonathan said, Bring it up. Walter nodded and walked toward a wall terminal near the executive reception desk. Richard followed him with his eyes, then turned back to Jonathan. What exactly are you trying to establish? I already apologized. Victoria answered. You apologized after you learned her last name. I apologized because I realized I had handled the situation badly. Those are not the same thing. Richard gave a frustrated shake of his head. What do you want me to say? Victoria's expression did not change. That's another problem. You're trying to find the sentence that saves the deal. I'm trying to solve a problem. No, you're trying to solve the consequence. Walter called from the terminal. Mr. Bennett, I have the footage. Jonathan motioned for him to continue. The group moved toward the security monitor. Annie stayed beside her mother while Richard positioned himself slightly behind Jonathan. Walter selected the relevant camera. The video had no useful audio, but it did not need any. Annie appeared first, standing near the side corridor with her lunch container. She shifted to one side as she checked something in her bag. A moment later, Richard entered the frame at speed, his attention on the phone in his hand. His shoulder struck Annie. The container fell. Richard stopped. Even without sound, the sequence was clear. Walter paused the video. Jonathan looked at Richard. She didn't walk into you. Richard's mouth tightened. No, you walked into her. Yes. Annie said nothing. Walter resumed the footage. Richard could be seen pointing toward the floor. Carlos entered with his cart. Richard raised his hand and stopped him. Carlos tried again. Richard sent him away. Then came the moments when Richard pointed toward Annie's bag, took out his wallet, held out his hand, and stepped toward her as she refused. Walter paused again. Jonathan asked, Was that when you demanded money? Annie nodded. Yes. Richard spoke quickly. I've already admitted that was excessive. Jonathan turned toward him. Excessive? Richard exhaled. Wrong. Fine. It was wrong. Why? The question caught him. Richard frowned. Because I misread the situation. Jonathan shook his head. Try again. Richard looked from Jonathan to Victoria. Because I assumed she caused the spill. That explains the shoes, Jonathan said. It doesn't explain the food. Or her clothes. Or what you thought she earned. Or why you needed her on the floor cleaning while your employee stood 5 yards away. Richard's voice sharpened. What exactly are you asking me to confess to? Jonathan's expression hardened. I'm asking whether you understand your own behavior. I understand that I was rude. Annie finally spoke. You keep choosing the smallest word available. Richard turned toward her. What would you like me to call it? I don't need to name it for you. Well, everyone else seems eager to. Victoria stepped closer to Annie. Nobody is putting words in your mouth, Richard. We're listening to the ones that came out of it. Richard looked toward his general counsel, perhaps expecting help. The attorney remained silent. That irritated him further. Fine, Richard said. I made assumptions. I judged her clothes. I judged the food. I thought she worked in a lower-level position. I was wrong. I've said that. What else is there? Jonathan answered. The part where you still think the problem was being wrong about her position. Richard frowned. Jonathan continued. Suppose Annie had been a catering worker. Richard said nothing. Suppose she worked for facilities. Suppose she came here to deliver paperwork. Would any of this become acceptable? No. Would you have apologized before learning she was my daughter? Richard hesitated. That hesitation lasted only a second, but everyone noticed it. Annie looked at him. There it is. Richard's frustration returned. What do you want from me, Annie? The truth. I am telling you the truth. No. You're telling us whatever you think keeps the signatures on that table. Richard looked toward the conference suite again. His eyes stopped on the binders. Annie noticed that too. Victoria said, "You still haven't asked Annie if she's okay." Richard turned quickly. "Of course I care whether she's okay, but you didn't ask." He looked at Annie. "Are you okay?" Annie gave him a long look. "Now?" Richard's face tightened again. Jonathan stepped between the exchange before it went further. "We're going to take 10 minutes. Richard looked alarmed. "For what?" "To talk as a family and as business partners on our side. You can use my office." "No." Jonathan turned toward Bennett Global's general counsel. "Use the smaller conference room across the hall." The attorney nodded. Richard took a step after him. "Jonathan, before you do that, hear me out." Jonathan stopped. Richard lowered his voice. "Whatever you think of me right now, Halston Industries is bigger than one person. This agreement is good for Bennett Global. You know that. I do. It's good for your employees. Yes. It's good for ours. Yes. Then don't make this decision emotionally." Annie saw her father's expression change. Jonathan turned fully toward Richard. "You think protecting my company from a leadership problem is emotional? That isn't what I said. It's exactly what you implied." Richard opened his mouth, but Jonathan continued. "If I sign today, I'm attaching my family's name and my employee's future to yours for 10 years. I need to know what happens when the person across from you doesn't have my bank account, my title, or my leverage." Richard said nothing. Jonathan looked toward the conference room where the unsigned documents waited. "That is not emotion, Richard. That is due diligence." He turned away. Victoria placed one hand lightly against Annie's back and walked with her toward the smaller conference room. Bennett's advisors followed. Before Annie crossed the doorway, Richard called her name. "Annie." She stopped but did not turn immediately. "I am sorry," he said. "I mean that." Annie looked over her shoulder. "Then be sorry, even if the deal is gone." Richard's expression changed. Annie entered the conference room with her parents, and the door closed behind them. Inside the smaller conference room, Jonathan waited until the door closed before speaking. He did not sit. Victoria remained beside Annie while Bennett Global's general counsel, Marcus Reed, placed his folder on the table and looked toward Jonathan for direction. Annie was the first to speak. "I'm sorry this happened today." Jonathan turned to her. "Why are you apologizing?" "Because this was supposed to be the signing. There are people downstairs, lawyers, the press team, everyone expecting this to happen. That still doesn't make it yours to apologize for." Annie looked toward the closed door. "If I hadn't come early, none of this would have happened." Victoria shook her head. "No, if you hadn't come early, we might never have known." Annie thought about that. It was the part that bothered her most. Richard had changed the moment Walter called her Miss Bennett. His voice had changed. His posture had changed. Even the way he used her name had changed. He was completely different after Walter said my last name. Jonathan pulled out a chair but remained standing behind it. "That's what concerns me." Marcus opened the agreement. "From a legal standpoint, we can walk away. The final execution hasn't happened. There will be costs tied to the closing process and outside counsel, but nothing that forces Bennett Global to proceed." Jonathan nodded. "I'm not worried about the legal fees. I know. I'm giving you the clean answer before we get into the business answer." Victoria looked at Marcus. "Give us that too." Marcus turned several pages. "The deal still makes financial sense. Halston's industrial network gives us access we don't currently have at the same scale. We've spent almost a year building this structure. Walking away means restarting a process that could take months. And signing means 10 years with Richard Halston," Victoria said. Marcus nodded. "That's the other side of it." Annie looked at her parents. "You don't have to cancel because of me." Jonathan pulled the chair out for her. "Sit for a minute." "I'm fine." "I know, sit anyway." Annie sat, and Jonathan took the chair across from her. "This is not about canceling because someone insulted my daughter," he said. "If that were the only issue, I could demand an apology, change a few terms, and make Richard uncomfortable for an afternoon. That isn't the decision in front of me." "Then what is? Whether I can trust his judgment?" Annie listened. Jonathan continued. "He thought you had no influence over him. That matters. A 10-year partnership creates thousands of situations where people with less leverage than Richard will depend on his decisions. Employees, contractors, drivers, vendors, managers who can't threaten to walk away with a billion-dollar agreement. Victoria took the seat beside Annie. He showed us how he handles someone when he thinks there's no cost to being cruel. Annie lowered her eyes for a moment. Maybe today scared him enough to change. Maybe, Victoria said. Jonathan nodded. People can change. I hope he does. Then shouldn't we give him that chance? Jonathan leaned forward slightly. There's a difference between wishing someone well and putting thousands of people in a position where they have to find out whether he learned his lesson. That answer stayed with Annie. Marcus closed one section of the agreement. There's another issue. Richard's behavior after he realized who Annie was. Victoria looked at him. Exactly. Annie knew what he meant. He didn't ask if I was okay, she said. He asked to deal with it after the signing. Jonathan nodded, which means his first instinct was still protecting the transaction. He apologized. After his options changed, Annie looked toward the door again. He did sound sorry at the end. Victoria's voice softened. He may be sorry, but we don't know yet what he's sorry for. For what he said, or for who he said it to. Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Annie remembered Richard holding out his hand and demanding her wallet. The amount itself had never mattered. $4,000 would not change her life. Richard had assumed it would. Worse, he had seemed to enjoy putting her in the position of having to admit whether she could afford it. I think I know, Annie said. Jonathan waited. If I had told him who I was when it started, he would have apologized immediately. Yes, but then we wouldn't know any of this. No. Annie looked at her father. So what happens now? Jonathan turned to Marcus. How quickly can we suspend the closing? Immediately. Not suspend. Marcus understood. Terminate? Yes. Annie looked up. Dad. Jonathan faced her. I'm not doing this for you. She frowned slightly. I'm doing it because of what we learned through you. Victoria reached across and placed her hand over Annie's. That distinction matters. Marcus took out his phone. Do you want me to notify Halston's counsel before we go back out? Jonathan considered it, then shook his head. No. Richard has spent 11 months speaking to me directly whenever he wanted something. I can give him the same courtesy now. Victoria stood, and no press statement until our people are out of the building. Agreed. Annie rose with them. What do I say? Jonathan looked surprised. You don't have to say anything. He's going to talk to me. Probably. What if he apologizes again? Jonathan adjusted his jacket. Listen. And then? Decide whether you believe him. Forgiveness is yours to give or not give. The contract isn't. That separated the two things in Annie's mind for the first time. A person could apologize. Someone else could forgive. Neither act erased the business consequence. Marcus gathered the documents, but Jonathan stopped him. Leave the signing copy here. Marcus set the thick binder back on the table. Jonathan looked at it for a moment. 11 months of meetings, projections, negotiations, and promises sat inside those pages. Then he opened the door. Richard was waiting across the hallway with his general counsel. The second he saw Jonathan, he stepped forward. Thank you for hearing me out. Jonathan walked past him toward the main conference suite. Richard followed. Jonathan, I want you to know I'm prepared to make this right. We'll talk inside. Everyone entered the large conference room. The nameplates were still arranged across the table. Fresh water stood beside each chair. 3 fountain pens waited on top of the final agreements. Richard moved toward his seat but did not sit. Jonathan stood at the head of the table. Richard, before you say anything else, I want to make one thing clear. This decision is not punishment for insulting Annie. Richard's shoulders loosened slightly, as though he heard hope in the sentence. Jonathan continued, It's a judgment about whether Bennett Global can trust your leadership for the next 10 years. Richard's expression changed. Jonathan turned to Marcus. Close the files. Marcus picked up the signing binder and shut it. Richard stepped forward. Jonathan, wait. Jonathan looked at him. The agreement is over. Richard looked at Jonathan as if the sentence had been spoken in another language. The agreement is over. For several seconds, he did not move. Then he gave a short, disbelieving laugh and stepped closer to the table. No, we're not doing this. We are not ending 11 months of work in 30 seconds. Jonathan did not touch the closed binder. Richard looked at Marcus. Open it. Marcus kept his hands at his sides. I'm speaking to you, Marcus answered. I represent Bennett Global, Mr. Halston. Richard turned back to Jonathan. Fine, then you open it. No, Jonathan, think about what you're saying. I have. You had 10 minutes across the hall. That was enough. Richard shook his head and walked around the end of the table. This agreement is worth $1.2 billion over 10 years. We have facilities planned around it. We have international partners waiting on confirmation. Your people have spent thousands of hours on this. So have yours. Exactly. Which is why this is insane. Victoria spoke before Jonathan could answer. Be careful, Richard. He looked at her. I'm talking about the decision. You're talking about our judgment because you don't like the result. Richard pressed one hand against the table. I don't like throwing away a profitable partnership over one afternoon. Jonathan said, You still think this is about one afternoon? What else would it be about? Leadership. Richard's frustration showed immediately. There's that word again. Yes. You've known me for almost a year. I've negotiated with you for almost a year. That's the same thing. No, it isn't. Richard gave him a hard look. We've sat across tables in Chicago, New York, London. We've gone through projections, labor plans, port access, distribution contracts. You've met my executives, and every one of those meetings gave you a reason to be on your best behavior. Richard opened his hands. So now nothing I've done counts? Jonathan answered, It counts. So does today. Richard turned toward Annie. This is because of you. Victoria took a step forward, but Annie answered first. No, this is because of you. Richard's face tightened. You know what I mean. I do. You want someone else to carry the consequence. I'm trying to understand how an argument in a hallway became $1 billion decision. Annie looked at him. Because you thought I couldn't affect that decision. Richard looked away. Jonathan said, That is exactly the issue. Richard pointed toward the binder. Then change the agreement. Jonathan's eyebrows lifted slightly. Add oversight. Add reporting. Put one of your people on the Joint Operating Committee. Give Bennett more control. If you're worried about leadership risk, write protections into the contract. Marcus glanced at Jonathan but said nothing. Richard continued quickly. We can amend governance today. We can create an escalation clause. We can put conduct language into executive oversight. You want more approval rights? Fine. You want quarterly reviews? Fine. Jonathan's answer was simple. No. Richard stared at him for a moment before catching himself and looking toward the windows instead. You haven't even heard the terms. I heard the problem. Then tell me what number fixes it. Victoria gave a short, humorless laugh. There it is. Richard turned toward her. This is business. That's exactly what Jonathan is treating it as. I'm offering concessions. You're pricing character. Richard looked at Jonathan again. 1 point better on the margin split. No. Tfu. No. I'll move another $50 million into the initial infrastructure commitment. No. Richard's voice rose. Then tell me what you want. Jonathan answered, Nothing from you. That stopped him. Richard placed both hands on the back of a chair. You cannot be serious. I am. You're willing to walk away from money that benefits your company because I spoke badly to Annie. I'm willing to walk away because you showed me how quickly basic respect disappears when you think a person has no leverage. Richard shook his head. I said I was wrong. Yes. I apologized. Yes. Then what exactly is an apology worth to you? Jonathan considered the question. An apology is not a receipt. You don't hand it over and get the consequence refunded. Annie glanced toward her father. Richard did too. Jonathan continued. If you mean the apology, it matters. If you're only making it because you want the contract, then it matters less. Richard looked at Annie again. I meant it. She said, Then you shouldn't need the deal to survive for it to be real. I don't. Good. Richard's jaw tightened. That's easy for you to say. Annie's expression changed. Why? Because you lose nothing. Jonathan immediately said, That's false. Richard looked at him. We lose money. We lose time. We lose a partnership our teams worked hard to build. We lose the opportunity this agreement was supposed to create. Then why are you doing it? Because profit is not the only risk on a 10-year contract. Richard gave a frustrated laugh. You're making me sound like some kind of threat to your workforce. Jonathan replied, Today you tried to make a person pay $4,000 because you assumed she couldn't challenge you. I made a bad judgment, and I am making mine. Richard's general counsel finally spoke. Perhaps both sides should take 24 hours before making an irreversible decision. Marcus looked toward Jonathan. Jonathan answered immediately. No. Richard turned to his attorney. Stay out of it. The attorney stopped. Richard walked toward Annie. He kept several feet between them this time. Annie, I owe you an apology. Not because of your parents. Not because of the agreement. I was wrong. She listened. I should not have spoken to you that way. I should not have assumed anything about you. I should have listened when you told me what happened. Annie nodded once. That's better. Hope appeared in his face. Then help me fix this. Her expression changed. There it is again. What? You apologized. And before the apology had even settled, you asked me for something. Richard's mouth closed. Annie continued. If you're sorry, be sorry. Don't turn it into a negotiation. He looked at Jonathan. Are you really letting this happen? Jonathan's answer came without hesitation. I'm making it happen. Richard stepped toward the table again. Jonathan, if you walk out now, the press will ask questions. They can ask. Our boards will ask questions. They should. People will lose money. Jonathan nodded. That part matters to me. Then act like it. Jonathan's face hardened. Do not confuse concern for employees with fear of losing a deal. Richard said nothing. Jonathan turned to Marcus. Notify our legal team that closing is canceled. No public statement until we're downstairs. Marcus took out his phone. Understood. Richard looked at Victoria. You're actually going along with this? Victoria answered. I reached the same decision before Jonathan said it. He looked at Annie one last time. And you? Annie adjusted the strap on her bag. I think you should spend less time asking who cost you this deal. Richard's face tightened. She continued. And more time asking why it took my last name to make you regret what you did. Jonathan picked up his document case. Victoria moved beside Annie. The fountain pens remained untouched on the table. Richard looked at them, then at the three Bennetts preparing to leave. His voice dropped. Jonathan, please. Jonathan paused at the door. Richard said, we can still save this. Jonathan looked back at him. No, Richard. You could have saved it in the hallway. Richard stood by the conference room door as Jonathan, Victoria, and Annie stepped into the hallway. For a second, he seemed unable to accept that they were actually leaving. Then he followed. Jonathan, wait. Jonathan kept walking. Richard quickened his pace. At least let our legal team speak before you leave the building. They already know our decision. You can reconsider a decision. Not this one. Victoria stayed beside Annie as they approached the elevators. Marcus followed a few steps behind, typing a message to Bennett Global's legal team. Richard moved around them and reached the elevator first, turning to face Jonathan. You're putting thousands of people at risk over something I can correct. Jonathan stopped a few feet away. Our employees are exactly why I'm leaving. How does canceling a profitable agreement protect them? Because I'm not signing 10 years of cooperation with a leader who needs to know someone's net worth before deciding how to treat them. Richard shook his head. That's not who I am, Annie spoke. It was who you were. When you thought I couldn't do anything about it. Richard looked at her. His voice dropped. I made a terrible judgment. You made several. I know that now. Victoria pressed the elevator button. Knowing it after the contract disappears is different from knowing it when Carlos offered to help. Richard looked toward Annie again. I'm asking for one chance to make this right. Annie did not answer immediately. He continued. I'll reimburse your lunch. I'll replace anything that was damaged. I'll apologize to Carlos and Melissa. I'll review the way this floor is managed. Whatever it takes. Annie's eyebrows rose slightly. You want to reimburse my lunch? Yes. My mother made it. Richard hesitated. Then I'll apologize to her too. Victoria looked at him. I'm standing right here. He turned toward her at once. Victoria, I'm sorry. What I said about the food was insulting. I had no right to speak about something you prepared for your daughter that way. Victoria gave him a measured look. That apology is for me. The way you treated Annie is another matter. I understand. Do you? Richard opened his mouth, then stopped. The elevator indicator began descending toward their floor. Jonathan said, There's something you still haven't understood. Richard turned to him. You keep offering repairs. Money. New terms. Reviews. Apologies. You think if you put enough pieces back on the table, the transaction comes back. What else am I supposed to do? Except that some choices cost more than you expected. Richard's face tightened. That's easy to say when you're the one walking away. Jonathan answered, You think walking away costs us nothing? Richard said nothing. We spent 11 months on this too. Our people traveled. Our lawyers worked nights. We built projections around your network. There are employees on our side who believed this partnership would create opportunities for them. Then don't take those opportunities away. Jonathan's voice hardened. You still think I'm taking something away from them? I'm choosing what kind of leadership I'm willing to connect them to. Richard looked toward the closed conference room doors. You know this company. You know I built it. That doesn't make every decision you make a good one. I can change. I hope you do. Then give me the chance. Jonathan shook his head. Changing is your responsibility. Testing whether you mean it is not ours. The elevator arrived. The doors opened, revealing Walter inside. He had apparently come up to escort the Bennett party back downstairs. When he saw them, he stepped aside. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett. Jonathan nodded. Walter. Richard moved closer. Jonathan, please. One meeting tomorrow. No lawyers if you don't want them. Just you and me. No. Tonight, then. No. I'll come to your office. No. Richard's voice lost some of its control. You cannot erase 11 months in one afternoon. Jonathan turned before entering the elevator. I'm not erasing anything. I'm remembering what today added to it. Richard had no answer. Victoria entered first. Annie followed, but Richard called her name before she crossed fully inside. Annie. She turned. He stood in the hallway with his jacket still perfectly buttoned, but nothing else about him carried the certainty he had shown earlier. I am sorry. Annie studied his face. This time Richard did not add another offer. He did not mention the contract. He simply said, I should have listened to you when you said I walked into you. I should have apologized. I should never have spoken about your clothes, your food, or what I thought you could afford. I was wrong. Annie nodded once. That's the first apology you've given me without asking for something afterward. Richard lowered his eyes for a moment. I know. I hope you remember that. I will. Annie stepped into the elevator. Richard looked at Jonathan. Is there really nothing I can say? Jonathan answered, Not today. Walter reached toward the control panel. Before the doors closed, Richard tried one final time. Annie. I didn't know who you were. She looked at him. That's still the point, Mr. Halston. The doors closed between them. For several floors, nobody spoke. Annie watched the numbers drop above the doors until Victoria touched her hand. You okay? Annie nodded. I think so. Then she looked at her father. Did I ruin this? Jonathan turned toward her immediately. No. If I hadn't come early, we might have signed. That's what I mean. Jonathan shook his head. You didn't cost us a deal. Annie waited. You saved us from a partner. She looked down at the visitor badge still clipped to her shirt. Nothing about it had changed since she entered the building. Neither had she. Only Richard's behavior had changed once he learned the name behind it. Walter glanced toward Annie, then back at the elevator doors. Jonathan said, Thank you for looking after her. Walter gave a small nod. Of course, sir. The elevator reached the lobby. As the doors opened, Marcus's phone vibrated. He checked the message. Legal has notified Halston's counsel. Closing is officially canceled. Jonathan nodded. Behind them, 50 floors above, 3 fountain pens were still sitting beside 3 unsigned agreements. At exactly 2 o'clock, the press team waiting downstairs received a 6-word message. The Bennett signing will not proceed. The 6-word message reached the press team before Jonathan, Victoria, and Annie reached the revolving doors. Within seconds, phones began vibrating across the lobby. A public relations manager near the reception desk read the message twice before hurrying toward Marcus. Mr. Reed. The reporters are already asking why the signing was canceled. Marcus kept walking. Tell them Bennett Global will issue a statement when we're ready. Should we say negotiations are continuing? No. She slowed. So this is final? Marcus looked at Jonathan. Jonathan answered for himself. Yes. The woman nodded and stepped away to make the call. Outside, a black SUV waited at the curb. Jonathan opened the rear door for Victoria and Annie, then paused before getting in. Several members of the Bennett legal team were crossing the lobby behind them. Marcus stopped. Make sure nobody on our side speaks about what happened to the press. Understood. I don't want Annie turned into a headline. Annie looked at her father. You don't have to protect me from every question. That isn't what I'm doing. Victoria settled into the vehicle. Your father is protecting the decision from becoming entertainment. Jonathan nodded. This is a business judgment. Richard's behavior explains it, but we are not building a public spectacle around you. Annie accepted that. Marcus asked, what should I tell Halston's counsel if they request another meeting? No meeting today. And tomorrow? Jonathan looked back through the glass doors of Halston Tower. Same answer. He got into the SUV. 50 floors above them, Richard was still standing outside the elevator. His general counsel, Peter Lawson, approached from the conference suite carrying a phone. Richard did not respond. Richard, we need to talk. That got his attention. Peter lowered his voice. Bennett Council has formally notified us that closing is canceled. I know. The board needs to be informed immediately. Richard looked at him. No. Peter frowned. No? Not until I speak to Jonathan again. They've terminated the closing. They can change their minds. Maybe. But until they do, we have a material problem. Richard walked back toward the conference suite. Call Marcus Reed. I already did. And? He said all communication goes through council. Richard stopped. Call Jonathan directly. Peter's expression tightened. I'm your lawyer, not your assistant. Then advise me. My advice is to stop calling them for the next hour and notify your board before someone else does. Richard entered the conference room. The signing table looked exactly as it had 20 minutes earlier. Nameplates, bottled water, pens, documents, everything prepared for a photograph that would never be taken. Richard picked up one of the fountain pens. They're bluffing. Peter stayed near the doorway. I don't think they are. You don't know Jonathan. I know what a termination notice looks like. Richard put the pen down harder than necessary. This partnership makes sense for them. Yes, they need our technology. They have alternatives. Not at our scale. Not today. Richard turned. What is that supposed to mean? It means your leverage is not the same as it was this morning. Richard walked toward the windows. One bad exchange doesn't erase a year of negotiations. Peter did not answer. Richard looked back. Say something. You want legal advice or reassurance? Legal advice. Then stop describing it as one bad exchange. Richard's face tightened. Peter continued. There were witnesses. There is security footage. You demanded money from a member of the Bennett family after causing the collision yourself. You ordered an employee not to clean the spill. You threatened security removal. Then your behavior changed after you learned her identity. Richard rubbed his forehead. I know what happened. Then understand how the board will hear it. They'll hear that I made a mistake. They'll hear that your judgment cost the company a $1.2 billion strategic agreement. Richard walked to the table and gripped the back of a chair. We haven't lost it yet. Peter's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Board chair. Richard held out his hand. Give it to me. Peter answered instead. Peter Lawson. A pause. Yes, I'm with him now. Richard watched his face. No, the signing did not occur. Another pause. Yes, Bennett Global terminated. Peter listened for several seconds. I understand. He ended the call. Richard asked, what did he say? The emergency board call is at 4. Cancel it. Peter gave him a look. You can't cancel an emergency board call requested by the board chair. Richard walked away from the table. Fine, I'll explain. Peter gathered the unused signing copies. You should prepare to explain more than the canceled ceremony. What else? The expansion financing. Richard turned back. Peter continued. The credit package assumes the Bennett Alliance closes today. It can be revised. Maybe. The European distribution agreement is conditional on Bennett access. We know. The warehouse commitments were approved based on projected volume. I know. Peter closed the first binder. Richard's voice sharpened. Stop saying things I already know. I'm saying them because 30 minutes ago they were connected to a signed partnership. Now they're connected to nothing. Richard looked toward the Bennett nameplates. For the first time, the financial consequence began to take shape beyond the lost photographs and the humiliation in the hallway. His phone vibrated. The board chair. Then another call appeared underneath it. Chief Financial Officer. Then Head of Investor Relations. Richard ignored all three. Peter watched him. You need to answer. I need Jonathan Bennett. You don't have Jonathan Bennett. Richard picked up his phone and called anyway. Jonathan's number rang once, then went to voicemail. Richard called again. Voicemail. A third time. Peter finally said, "Stop." Richard lowered the phone. "He'll answer eventually. Maybe. He has too much money invested in this process to walk away without reconsidering." Peter shook his head. "That sentence is exactly why you still don't understand what happened." Richard looked at him. Peter held his chaza. "You keep assuming everyone has a price because you do." Richard's face hardened. "Be very careful." "I am. That's why I'm telling you the truth before the board does." Richard said nothing. Peter picked up the final binder. At the bottom of the table sat Annie's empty name position, added only that morning for her observation notes. Richard noticed it now, not because the paper had changed, because he finally understood how much he had decided about someone before learning a single useful fact. His phone vibrated again. This time he answered. "Richard Halston." The board chair spoke for less than 20 seconds. Richard listened, then his face changed. When the call ended, Peter asked, "What happened?" Richard slowly lowered the phone. "The bank wants confirmation by 5 that the Bennett agreement is still active." Peter said nothing. Richard looked at the unsigned documents. "And if we can't give it?" Peter already knew the answer. "They review the financing package." Richard sat down for the first time since the Bennetts left. The deal had been dead for less than an hour. The consequences had already started moving. At 4 o'clock, Richard joined the emergency board call from the same conference room where the Bennett agreement was supposed to have been signed. Peter sat 2 seats away with a legal pad in front of him, while Halston Industries' chief financial officer, Dana Mercer, appeared on the wall screen beside 6 board members. Board chair William Crowley spoke first. "Richard, we need a factual account. No interpretation, no public relations language. What happened?" Richard adjusted his cuff. "There was an incident with a member of the Bennett family before the signing." William's expression tightened. "Which member?" "Their daughter, Annie Bennett." Dana looked down at something on her desk. William continued. "And the incident resulted in Bennett Global terminating the agreement?" "Yes." "What did you do?" Richard paused. "We collided in the executive hallway. Her lunch fell. I believed she had caused it." Peter said nothing. Richard continued. "I reacted badly." A board member named Elaine Foster leaned toward her camera. "Define badly." Richard looked at Peter, then back at the screen. "I made comments about the food. I assumed she was support staff. I told her to clean the spill." Elaine waited. "Anything else?" Richard's mouth tightened. Peter spoke. Richard also demanded reimbursement for his shoes and threatened to have security remove Miss Bennett from the floor. Richard turned toward him. "I can answer for myself," William said. "Then answer completely." Richard looked back at the screen. "Yes. I asked her to cover the cost of the shoes." "How much?" $4,000. Dana closed her eyes briefly. William's voice remained controlled. "Did she damage the shoes?" "There was sauce on one of them." "That was not my question." "No, there was no permanent damage." Elaine asked, "Who caused the collision?" Richard hesitated. Peter answered. "Security footage shows Richard came around the corner looking at his phone and struck Miss Bennett." William removed his glasses. Richard immediately said, "I admitted that once we reviewed the footage." "When did you review it?" "After Jonathan and Victoria arrived." Elaine asked. "So before that, you blamed Annie Bennett?" "Yes." "Did you know who she was?" "No." William put his glasses back on. "When did your behavior change?" Richard did not answer quickly enough. Peter did. After Senior Security Officer Walter Green addressed her as Miss Bennett. Richard turned toward Peter again. That phrasing makes it sound calculated. Peter looked at him. "Was it inaccurate?" Richard said nothing. Dana finally spoke. "I need to move this to the financial exposure." William nodded. "Go ahead." Dana brought up a spreadsheet. "The $600 million expansion credit facility has not been withdrawn, but the bank has suspended final confirmation pending review. Their credit committee wants updated projections without Bennett volume." Richard said, "We can replace the volume. Not by 5 o'clock." "I didn't say by 5, Dana continued. "The European distribution agreement has a Bennett access condition. If Bennett Global is no longer participating, that contract does not activate under its current form. We renegotiate, possibly, but the projected first-year revenue attached to that agreement is already included in the board-approved expansion model." Richard pushed his chair back slightly. "Then revise the model." Dana looked directly into the camera. "That is what we are doing. The revised model is worse." Nobody spoke for a moment. Dana continued. We also have commitments on 2 warehouse facilities in Illinois and 1 in Ohio. Those leases were approved based on projected traffic from the Bennett partnership. Richard said, "We can sublease if necessary." "Yes. So this is manageable." Dana's face showed no relief. Manageable is not the same as harmless. William looked at Richard. "Why did we commit to those facilities before final signature?" Richard answered, "Because the deal was effectively done." Elaine leaned forward. "Apparently it wasn't. We had agreed on every major term. And yet we did not have signatures." Richard's frustration showed. "This board approved the expansion plan," William replied, "based on management's recommendation that closing risk was minimal. It was minimal, until today." Richard looked away. Dana changed the screen. "The bank has also asked whether Bennett's termination reflects a broader governance concern." Richard turned back. "Tell them no. I can't tell a lender something we haven't assessed. It was a personnel dispute." Peter finally spoke again. Bennett Global explicitly characterized it as a leadership concern. Richard looked at him. "Whose side are you on?" Peter's expression did not change. "The company's." That answer irritated Richard more than an argument would have. William said, "Enough. Here is what happens now. Peter will lead an internal review of the incident. Dana will prepare revised projections without Bennett. Investor Relations will draft a holding statement. Richard, until the board completes its review, you will not contact Jonathan Bennett, Victoria Bennett, or Annie Bennett directly." Richard stared at the screen. "You are restricting me from contacting a business partner? A former prospective partner? That's absurd. It's a board instruction." Richard leaned forward. "You don't get to remove the CEO from negotiations because of one mistake," William answered. "We're not removing you from negotiations. There are no negotiations." Richard's face hardened. Elaine spoke next. "And before you argue that this is overreaction, understand something. The problem isn't only the canceled deal. The problem is judgment. If you treated someone that way because you thought she had no influence, the board has to ask where else that judgment appears." Richard looked from one face to another on the screen. "You all know me," William replied. "We know the version of you that appears in board meetings." The sentence landed. Richard turned toward Peter, perhaps expecting him to object. Peter did not. William continued. "I want witness statements from every employee present in that hallway. Carlos, Melissa, Walter. Anyone else identified on the security recording?" Richard said, "You're interviewing my employees about me? We're reviewing a material event that may cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars. I built this company." William's answer came immediately. "And the board is responsible for protecting it." Richard looked down at the unused fountain pen near his hand. For years, that sentence had worked in his favor. Protecting the company had usually meant supporting him, trusting him, giving him room to make decisions quickly. Now the same principle was being applied to him. Dana spoke again. "There's one more thing." Richard looked up. "The bank requested a call tomorrow morning with me, William, and Peter." "Why Peter?" "They want governance represented." Richard understood what she meant before she said anything else. "They don't want me on the call?" Dana chose her words carefully. "They didn't ask for you." Richard sat very still. William ended the meeting with a final instruction. "No external statements tonight beyond confirmation that the signing did not proceed. We reconvene at 9 tomorrow." The screen went dark. Richard remained seated. Peter closed his legal pad. Richard asked, "Do you think they're preparing to remove me?" Peter did not answer immediately. "That depends on what they find. You were there. You already know what happened." "Yes." Richard looked at him. "Then answer me." Peter stood and gathered his papers. "I think the board is asking a question you should have asked yourself before the Bennetts ever got off that elevator." Richard's face tightened. "Which is?" Peter looked at him. "What kind of man are you when you think the person in front of you has nothing you need?" Then he left Richard alone with 3 unsigned agreements and a phone that had finally stopped ringing. By 7:30 the next morning, Dana Mercer had already rebuilt Halston Industries' expansion model without Bennett Global. The result was sitting in front of Richard when he entered the executive conference suite. He took one look at the numbers and said, "This can't be right." Dana remained standing beside the screen. "I checked it twice. The first-year international revenue projection had been cut nearly in half. 2 planned distribution hubs no longer reached their required volume. The European launch had been pushed back. and the credit package that had seemed routine 24 hours earlier now carried a large question mark beside it. Richard set the printed pages on the table. You're assuming we replace none of the Bennett business. I'm showing the bank what exists today. We have alternatives. Then give me names. He looked at her. Dana waited. We've spoken to other logistics groups. Not one of them gives us Bennett's network. We can combine 2 or 3. Maybe. That takes time, different contracts, different pricing, and new approvals. The bank isn't asking what we might assemble 6 months from now. They're asking what supports the borrowing today. Richard walked toward the windows. So tell them we're restructuring the partnership. With whom? He turned. Dana, I'm not attacking you. I'm asking the question they're going to ask in 30 minutes. Peter entered carrying a folder. William Crowley followed him. Richard looked at the board chair. I thought this was a bank call. It is. Then why are you here in person? William pulled out a chair. Because after the call, we're discussing the review. Richard looked at Peter. You finished it overnight? Preliminary findings. That fast? The hallway incident lasted less than 20 minutes. There were 6 witnesses and security video. This isn't a complicated fact pattern. Richard's jaw tightened. You interviewed everyone? Yes. Including Carlos? Yes. And Melissa? Yes. Walter? Yes. Richard gave a small shake of his head. Unbelievable. William looked at him. What part? My own company interviewing people as if I committed some crime. Peter set the folder down. No one said crime. It certainly feels like you're trying to build a case. We are documenting an event that caused a $1.2 billion agreement to collapse. Richard did not answer. Dana's laptop chimed. The bank is joining. The call began with 2 senior credit officers and an outside risk advisor. They did not ask about Annie first. They asked about revenue, volume assumptions, warehouse commitments, European expansion, and contingency plans. Richard answered the first several questions himself. We have other logistics options. One credit officer, Martin Keene, responded. Have any of those options signed letters of intent? Not yet. Term sheets? No. Confirmed capacity? We've had preliminary conversations. Martin paused. Then for underwriting purposes, we have no replacement capacity. Dana glanced at Richard but said nothing. The second officer asked, how much of the projected debt service coverage depended on Bennett-related volume? Dana answered, approximately 31% in the first 18 months. Richard immediately added, which is not the same thing as saying we can't replace it. The risk advisor spoke next. Mr. Halston, our concern is broader than replacement volume. Bennett Global terminated a nearly completed strategic agreement based on what they described as leadership concerns. We need to understand whether that creates additional counterparty risk. Richard's voice hardened. It was a personal disagreement. Peter spoke. The Bennett termination notice references executive judgment and partner suitability. Richard turned toward him. Martin said, that distinction matters to us. Richard faced the speaker on the screen again. I made a mistake in a hallway. I apologized. I'm not sure how that becomes a credit issue. Martin answered without hesitation. Because the mistake affected a transaction your company used to support its expansion plan. No one said anything for a moment. The risk advisor continued. We're not making a moral judgment. We're evaluating whether management assumptions remain reliable. Richard's face tightened. Dana took over the conversation and walked them through the revised model. By the end of the call, the bank had not canceled the facility, but it had suspended final approval and requested a new plan within 30 days. When the screen went dark, Richard turned to William. There, 30 days, that's manageable. William did not react. Richard looked at Peter. What? Peter opened the folder. Carlos confirmed you prevented him from cleaning the spill after he offered twice. We know that. Melissa confirmed you rejected her suggestion to review security footage. We know that too. Walter confirmed you instructed security to remove Annie before you learned her identity. Richard rubbed one hand across his jaw. Are we going to repeat every sentence from yesterday? Peter continued. All 3 witnesses independently described a noticeable change in your tone after Walter addressed her as Miss Bennett. Richard gave a short laugh. A noticeable change in tone. That's what we're investigating now? William finally spoke. We're investigating judgment. I apologized. William nodded. And I believe you regret what happened. Richard looked at him. That doesn't answer what the board needs to decide. Which is, whether yesterday was an isolated failure or the clearest example we've had of a leadership pattern. Richard's expression hardened. Pattern? Peter slid several pages across the table. Richard did not touch them. What are those? Human resources reports from the last 3 years. His face changed. Peter continued. No discrimination findings. No formal misconduct ruling. But there are repeated complaints about how you speak to administrative employees, facilities, staff, drivers, and junior personnel. Richard looked toward William. You're digging through old complaints now? William answered. We asked whether yesterday was isolated, and you found people who don't like me. We found people who describe the same distinction. What distinction? Peter answered. You're measured with executives, much harsher with people who have less authority. Richard pushed the papers away. I run a demanding company. Dana spoke for the first time since the bank call ended. Demanding isn't the issue. Richard turned toward her. Now you too? She met his eyes. You asked people for honesty. I asked for solutions. You need both. Richard walked several steps away from the table. So what is this? You want me in some leadership seminar? Executive coaching? Fine. Put it on the calendar. William shook his head. No. Richard turned. The board voted early this morning. His face changed. Voted on what? Effective immediately. Major financing, expansion commitments, and strategic partnerships require board approval before you can act. Richard looked at him for several seconds. You're restricting my authority. Yes. I'm the CEO. For now. The words landed harder than William raised them. Richard took one step closer. What does that mean? William closed Peter's folder. It means we reconvene in 30 days to review whether you should remain CEO. Richard's face lost color. You're threatening to remove the founder of this company because one deal failed. William stood. No, Richard. The deal failed because of something the board can no longer afford to ignore. Richard looked from William to Dana, then Peter. No one stepped in to rescue him. His phone vibrated on the table. A message from his assistant appeared across the screen. European partner requests immediate call regarding Bennett withdrawal. Richard read it twice. Yesterday, he had believed the worst thing that could happen was losing the Bennett signatures. Now he was beginning to understand that the signatures had only been the first thing to go. The European partner called 12 minutes later. Richard took the call from his office with Dana and Peter seated across from him. William remained by the window, arms folded, listening. A man named Henrik Madsen appeared on the screen from Rotterdam. He had spent months negotiating warehouse access and distribution capacity with Halston Industries, and he wasted no time on greetings. Richard, I need a direct answer. Is Bennett Global still participating in the North American network? No. Henrik's expression changed. Temporarily, the agreement did not close. So no. Richard's jaw tightened. We're evaluating alternatives. Henrik turned towards someone off camera, then back. Our agreement assumes Bennett capacity in 6 major hubs. We know. And their port relationships. Yes. And their freight network. Yes. Henrik removed his glasses. Then what exactly are we buying from Halston under the current agreement? Richard shifted forward. You're buying the same industrial systems, the same technology, the same support, but not the distribution structure your proposal promised. We can replace that structure. When? We're working on it. Henrik shook his head. That isn't a date. Dana stepped in. Henrik, we're rebuilding the implementation schedule. Give us 72 hours and we can provide revised capacity projections. Henrik looked at her. I trust your numbers, Dana. I don't trust assumptions anymore. Richard's eyes narrowed. Henrik continued. We delayed another supplier because your team told us the Bennett partnership was effectively certain. It was. Apparently not. Richard's voice hardened. If you called to lecture me about something I already understand, this conversation isn't useful. Peter turned his head toward him. Henrik pauses. Then he said, This is exactly why I called. Richard frowned. What does that mean? It means my board asked whether Bennett walked away because the deal stopped making financial sense. It didn't. I know. Which means they walked away because they decided working with your leadership carried more risk than the money justified. Richard's face tightened. You've heard one side. I've heard enough to know the agreement is gone. That does not make me unreliable. Henrik answered. Reliability includes what happens when things go wrong. Richard pushed his chair slightly away from the desk. Dana stepped in before he could answer. Henrik, what is your position? We are suspending activation of our agreement until Halston can show replacement logistics capacity. For how long? 30 days. Richard said, that timeline is unreasonable. Henrik looked directly at him. So is building our launch around an unsigned partnership. Richard said nothing. Henrik continued, I'm not canceling today, but I'm not moving forward on promises either. The call ended. Richard looked at Dana. How much revenue? Year 1? Yes. Projected at 84 million. And if they terminate? We lose the launch and most of the related expansion volume. Richard got up and walked toward the side table. He poured water into a glass but left it there untouched. William said, this is why the board restricted your authority. Richard turned. I heard you the first time. Then stop acting as if every person who raises a concern is attacking you. I'm trying to keep the company moving. No, William said. You're trying to force everyone back into the plan you had yesterday. Richard's voice sharpened. Because yesterday's plan was good. Yesterday's plan depended on Bennett. Richard looked at him. And you think I don't know that? I think you know the fact. I'm not sure you've accepted what it means. Peter's phone vibrated. He checked the screen. Richard, we have another problem. Richard gave a humorless laugh. Of course we do. Chicago Tribune business desk is asking why Bennett canceled. William turned. What do they know? Only that the signing was scheduled and did not happen. Richard said, then tell them scheduling issue. Peter shook his head. That would be false. Tell them negotiations remain confidential. That part is true. Fine. Use it. Peter typed a response. Dana gathered her papers. I need to meet Treasury. If the bank changes the facility, we have to decide which projects get delayed first. Richard looked at her. Not the Ohio warehouse. That may be the first one. No, it has the least independent volume. We announced it to the county. I know. There are jobs attached to that facility. I know that too. Then find somewhere else. Dana's expression tightened. This is what I mean when I tell you numbers don't care about preference. Richard looked away. She continued. If Bennett volume is gone, Ohio doesn't support itself. Keeping it alive because canceling looks bad only burns more cash. William nodded. Bring the options to the board tomorrow. Donna left. Richard waited until the door closed. Then he said, she's enjoying this. Peter looked up. Dana? She's been waiting for the board to cut my authority for years. William's expression hardened. Stop. Richard turned toward him. That right there, William said. Someone tells you something you don't want to hear. And immediately, you make it about loyalty. She reports to me. She reports to the company. I am the company. The words came out before Richard seemed to realize how they sounded. Peter looked down. William held Richard's gaze. No, he said. You founded it. You built a large part of it. Your name is on the building. But you are not the company. Richard's jaw tightened. William continued. There are 14,000 employees who do not become less important because your name is bigger on the wall. Richard said nothing. His phone lit up with a message from his private banker. Call me urgently regarding collateral review. Richard read it once. Then again, Peter noticed. Personal or company? Richard locked the screen. Personal. William looked at him. Related to the expansion financing? Richard hesitated. Peter understood first. You pledged shares. Richard's face hardened. A portion. How much? That is none of your concern. If falling share value creates pressure on your voting position, it becomes the board's concern. Richard turned toward him. Nothing has fallen yet. Peter replied. Public markets haven't opened on the news because there is no public announcement. Lenders don't need a headline before they protect themselves. Richard picked up his phone. For the first time that morning, he did not call Jonathan Bennett. He called his banker. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. When it ended, Richard remained standing with the phone in his hand. William asked, what happened? Richard looked at the dark screen. They're reassessing the loan-to-value ratio on my pledged shares. Peter asked, margin call? Not yet. Could there be one? Richard did not answer. That was enough. William gathered his papers. We meet tomorrow at 9. Richard looked at him. You really think this can end with me losing control of my own company? William paused at the door. I think yesterday you learned that control can disappear faster than respect. Then he left. Richard stayed behind with Peter. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Richard looked toward the skyline and said, all because of one lunchbox. Peter closed his folder. No. Richard turned. Peter shook his head. The lunchbox didn't do anything. He walked toward the door. You did. 30 days later, Richard walked into the board meeting carrying a folder filled with numbers that would have impressed almost anyone a month earlier. Replacement logistics proposals, revised warehouse schedules, cost reductions, new lender terms, a preliminary agreement with a regional freight operator. None of it replaced Bennett Global. William Crowley sat at the head of the table. Dana Mercer was beside him, with Peter Lawson and the rest of the board arranged around the room. Richard placed his folder in front of his seat, but remained standing. Before we start, he said, I want everyone to understand that we have options. William nodded. You'll have time to present them. We don't need another debate about the hallway incident. No one scheduled one. Good. Richard sat. Dana brought the revised financial model onto the screen. The bank has agreed to keep the credit facility available, but at a reduced amount and with tighter covenants. The European launch remains suspended. The Ohio warehouse project should be postponed. Illinois can proceed at a smaller scale. Richard said, I disagree on Ohio. Dana continued. Halston can carry it, but doing so would consume cash for a facility that no longer has enough committed volume. We can build volume, eventually. Then we keep the site and build into it. Dana looked at William. That would increase our exposure. Richard turned toward her. You've made that point for a month, because the math has not changed. Richard tapped the folder in front of him. The regional carriers in here change it. Not enough. According to you, according to their capacity. William raised a hand. We'll vote on the facility separately. First, the leadership review. Richard's attention moved toward him. Peter opened a file. Richard gave him a tired look. We've already covered the witness statements. This is broader than those statements. What does that mean? Peter replied. Human Resources completed an expanded review of complaints and employee exit interviews involving executive conduct over the last 5 years. Richard's expression hardened. 5 years? Yes. You were supposed to review one incident. William answered. The board asked whether the incident reflected a larger pattern, and naturally you found one. Peter did not react to the sarcasm. We found repeated concerns involving communication with lower-level employees. Most never became formal complaints. Several people specifically said they did not believe reporting the behavior would change anything. Richard looked around the table. So now people who never filed complaints are evidence against me? They're information, Elaine Foster said. Richard turned toward her. Anonymous information. Some of it is signed. He paused. Elaine continued. You keep treating this as a courtroom. Nobody is deciding whether to send you anywhere. We're deciding whether you should continue running a 14,000-person company. I have run it successfully for years. William nodded. That matters. Apparently not enough. It matters. So does what has happened since Bennett walked. Richard opened his folder. Then let's talk about that. We still have revenue. We still have technology Bennett wanted. We still have customers. I've identified 3 possible logistics replacements, Dana said. 3 companies that together provide roughly 70% of the capacity Bennett offered. That is a starting point, at a significantly higher cost. We negotiate. Richard, not every problem disappears because you negotiate harder. His voice sharpened. And not every problem requires removing a founder. William looked at him. No one is removing the founder. Richard understood the wording. You're removing the CEO. William folded his hands on the table. The board voted this morning. Richard's face changed. You voted before hearing my proposal. We've heard your proposals for 30 days. How many? William glanced around the table. 9 in favor, 2 opposed, 1 abstention. Richard looked from one director to the next, as though the numbers might change if he identified the 2 people who had supported him. When? Effective at the end of today. Richard laughed once, without humor. You cannot be serious, Elaine answered. We are. I founded Halston Industries, William said, and that history is not being erased. My name is on the building. It will still be on the building tomorrow, but I won't be running the company. No. Richard looked toward Dana. And who is? William answered before she could. Dana will serve as interim CEO while the board conducts a search. Richard's eyes moved to her. You knew. Dana met his expression. I was informed this morning. How convenient. Don't do that. Do what? Turn this into betrayal because you don't want to accept the vote. Richard pushed his chair back and stood. I built the business you're all so eager to protect from me. William remained seated. Nobody here has forgotten what you built. Then act like it. We are. That's why we're protecting it. Richard looked at the papers in front of him. For years, board meetings had ended with people asking what he wanted to do next. Now the decision had already been made, without him. Peter spoke. There is also the matter of your pledged shares. Richard turned sharply. My private finances are not part of this meeting. They affect voting control. Richard said nothing. Peter continued. Your lender completed its collateral review. You've agreed to sell a portion of your holdings rather than post additional cash. William added. After the sale, you remain the largest individual shareholder, but you no longer hold enough voting influence to block major board actions alone. Richard looked at Peter. You've been busy. I'm doing my job. Richard closed the folder he had never opened. So that's it. William stood. It's the end of your term as CEO. It does not have to be the end of your relationship with the company. Richard gave him a hard look. You think I'm going to sit on some advisory committee while Dana runs what I built? That decision is yours. Richard picked up the folder. For once, he had no final argument. 2 months later, Bennett Global announced a strategic partnership with Meridian Freight Systems, one of Halston's largest competitors. The deal was smaller at first, with expansion tied to performance milestones rather than promises. Annie attended the first working session beside Jonathan and Victoria. The Meridian CEO arrived without an entourage. Before entering the meeting, he stopped to thank the driver who had brought him from the airport. Later, when coffee was served, he moved his own papers so the attendant would not have to reach across him. Nothing about it was dramatic. That was why Annie noticed. After the meeting, Jonathan asked, What did you see? Annie thought for a moment. He says thank you when nobody's scoring him. Jonathan smiled. That's usually a good place to start. Across Chicago, Richard received the Bennett Meridian announcement on his phone. He read it twice. Then he opened the financial news and watched analysts discuss the international network Halston had once expected to enter. The opportunity had not disappeared. It had simply moved on without him. Richard returned to Halston Tower 3 weeks after the board removed him as CEO. He no longer had meetings on the executive calendar, and no assistant waited outside the office that had carried his name for almost 20 years. His security badge still opened the building, but the access felt different now. People greeted him politely, then continued with their day. That bothered him more than open hostility would have. The company had kept moving. Dana Mercer had taken over the CEO role on an interim basis. The Ohio warehouse plan had been postponed. The European launch had been rewritten around a smaller network. Several expansion projects Richard once considered essential had been reduced or canceled. None of it looked impressive compared with the plan he had presented to the board months earlier. But the numbers were improving. Halston Industries had survived the loss of Richard's authority. That fact followed him all the way to the executive floor. Melissa was working near the reception desk when he arrived. She looked up. Good morning, Mr. Halston. Morning. There was a pause before Richard asked, Is the old conference suite being used? Not until 3. I need 10 minutes. Melissa nodded. Of course. Richard walked down the same hallway where the Bennett signing had collapsed. The floor had been cleaned long ago. No stain remained. The smell of Annie's lunch was gone. The security camera still sat above the corner, and Carlos's cleaning cart was nowhere nearby. Richard stopped at the exact place where he had held a handkerchief over his nose and demanded $4,000 from someone he had never bothered to identify properly. He could still hear himself. Cheap food. Your clothes. Take out your wallet. Clean it yourself. At the time, every sentence had felt justified to him because he had believed authority settled the argument. Now he understood something uglier. He had not wanted the truth. He had wanted obedience. Richard entered the conference suite. Most of the furniture was unchanged. The long table was still there, though the Bennett nameplates had disappeared months ago. The unused signing binders were gone too. Near the storage cabinet, however, something remained. A presentation board had been left behind from the canceled press event. Halston Industries plus Bennett Global. A billion-dollar partnership. Richard stood in front of it for a long time. He had blamed Jonathan, then the board, then the bank, then Peter, then Dana. For a while, he had even blamed Annie for arriving early. Each explanation had given him somewhere else to put the anger. None survived the question Peter had asked him. What kind of man are you when you think the person in front of you has nothing you need? Richard pulled out a chair and sat. His phone remained in his pocket. There was nobody to call. Bennett Global had moved forward with Meridian Freight Systems. The first phase of that partnership had already been announced. Financial analysts were calling it disciplined and strategically sound. Meridian would gain access to routes Halston once expected to use. Richard could not even call it revenge. Jonathan had simply chosen another partner. That was worse. The world had continued without needing to punish Richard personally. His own decisions had done enough. Richard lowered his head into his hands. After a while, he slipped from the chair until one knee touched the carpet, then the other. There was no audience, no press, no any, no Jonathan Bennett waiting to accept an apology. Richard stayed there because, for the first time in months, he stopped searching for someone else to blame. Across the city that evening, Annie sat at the kitchen table between Jonathan and Victoria while her mother reheated dinner. When Victoria placed the food in front of her, Annie laughed. Cornbread, collard greens, macaroni and cheese. Victoria raised an eyebrow. What? You did that on purpose. Did what? Annie pointed at the plate. This. Jonathan hid a smile behind his glass. Victoria sat down. Careful, wouldn't want your shirt smelling cheap. Mum. That made Jonathan laugh. For the first time in weeks, Annie laughed with them without immediately thinking about Halston Tower. Victoria passed her the cornbread. Eat. Annie took a piece. Jonathan watched her for a moment. You know Meridian officially approved Phase 1 today. I heard. Your mother pretended she wasn't checking her phone every 10 minutes. Victoria looked at him. I checked it 4 times. 8. 6. Annie smiled. I'm glad it worked out. Jonathan nodded. So am I. She looked down at her plate. Do you ever think we should have given Richard another chance? Victoria did not answer for her husband. Jonathan considered the question. I think people deserve the chance to become better. That sounds like yes. It isn't. Annie looked at him. Jonathan continued. Richard can become better without thousands of our employees being required to trust him while he figures out whether he means it. Annie nodded slowly. I understand that now. Victoria said. Forgiveness and access are different things. Annie looked at her. You can forgive someone, Victoria continued, without handing them the same key again. Jonathan added, and justice isn't always about watching somebody lose. Annie thought about Richard's removal, the bank review, the abandoned expansion plans. Then what is it? Sometimes it's simply refusing to protect people from the weight of their own choices. Victoria reached for Annie's plate and added another spoonful of macaroni. Annie laughed. I have enough. You always say that before taking more. Jonathan looked at his daughter. What did you learn from all of this? Annie took her time. I used to think power meant people couldn't treat you badly. And now, I think power just changes whether people believe they can get away with it. Jonathan nodded. That's part of it. What's the other part? He set his fork down. The goal isn't to become powerful enough that nobody can disrespect you. The goal is to become powerful without forgetting how it felt when someone did. Annie looked at him. Victoria added, and don't spend your life waiting for every Richard Halston to get what you think he deserves. Why not? Because justice doesn't always arrive on our schedule. Annie glanced between her parents. Victoria continued. But character leaves a trail. So does cruelty. So does kindness. Eventually people learn what they can trust. Jonathan smiled slightly. Make sure your trail is one you can live with. Later that night, Victoria packed leftovers into a fresh lunch container and placed it in front of Annie. Annie looked at it. Seriously? You lost the last one? That was not my fault. Jonathan nodded. I believe the security footage supports her position. Victoria laughed and slid the container across the table. The story of Richard Halston was never really about $1 billion. It was never about expensive shoes, executive floors, or a last name powerful enough to change a man's tone. If Annie had been an assistant, he still would have been wrong. If she had worked in catering, he still would have been wrong. If she had carried $5 in her wallet instead of access to billions, she still would have deserved an apology. Her identity did not make Richard's behavior wrong. It only forced him to pay attention to something that had been wrong from the beginning. Richard Halston had hired excellent lawyers, bankers, consultants, and advisors. He had examined contracts, forecasts, margins, and signatures, but he had failed to examine the one thing no agreement could repair for him: his own character. No market crash destroyed his $1 billion deal. No competitor stole it. No bank killed it. It disappeared because of the way one powerful man chose to treat Annie when he believed she was nobody. And that was what he understood too late. Nobody is nobody. This story reminds us that true character is revealed by how we treat people when we believe they have nothing to offer us. Respect should never depend on someone's clothes, job, race, wealth, or last name. Richard did not lose everything because Annie turned out to come from a powerful family. He lost it because his arrogance exposed who he was when he thought she had no power. The lesson is simple. Kindness is not weakness. Dignity has no price. And every choice we make leaves a trail that one day may lead back to us. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.